So far we've shown a whole bunch of examples using mail headers. So this is sort of if you're just looking at an email and trying to figure out, presumably one that you send, how will this thing perform under DMARC? And so now we're going to kind of flip it to the other side, which is, well, what's an actual DMARC policy look like? Where does it live in the DNS? Basically that whole side of things. In the private channel world, which we had before we released the public record format, you basically had to exchange a file of policy records with your partner in the private channel. When we released the record format into the public domain, as it were, now you can just stick this stuff in DNS. And so we've adopted the convention from DKIM of doing an underscore prefix on a subdomain of the domain you want to protect. So here the example is, if example.com had a DMARC record published, you'd find it at underscore dmarc.example.com. Going back to sort of the relationship of the organizational domain to the actual, the RFC 5322 from domain, in order to try to find a valid DMARC record, you start with the 5322 from domain like foo.example.com. And if you don't find one there, you skip all the way up to the top, which the top in our parlance is the organizational domain. And in order to do that, that's kind of goes back to why we advocate the use of the public suffix list in lieu of having a heuristic way of doing it. You go up there and look. Why that's particularly important may not be best illustrated by this example, but if instead of foo.example.com, you had a.b.c.d.e.f.g.example.com and you walked all the way up of that, somebody's DNS infrastructure is getting absolutely brutalized in the process of you finding that record. So we just skip right to the end. Those two things, the policy options that the spec currently contains, we're in the habit of talking about the form it is now, because once we sort of release this to the control of others, namely going to the IETF, it may change. But the model as we've envisioned it has essentially three forms for policy. The first one, none. There's a lot of confusion around whether it's none or monitor. Let us make it totally clear here that it's none. And you use none when you just want to publish a record and get reports back. None instructs the receiver, who's actually processing your DMARC record and evaluating your auth results against your email. It instructs them to not alter what happens to the mail based on the outcome of DMARC. So, at all the previous MAAWGs, when we get stopped after the training, people are always asking, like, how can I get the reports without, anything weird happening to my email? You publish a none policy, and we'll kind of get into the details of that in a minute. Quarantine is the idea that, you're not asking the receiver to throw the mail away if it fails the DMARC check, but if you're a receiver who has the notion of a spam folder or a junk folder, a message failing the DMARC check and being subject to a quarantine policy would wind up in the spam folder. If you're using an appliance, or if you have a tiered series of MTAs, like your border MTA and then internal MTAs, and you have a quarantine policy that you're processing, but you don't use a junk folder, the idea here is that maybe one of those MTAs would spool that message off and send a notification to the user or an admin, and just not deliver it, but kind of hold it. And then, of course, the final, most aggressive policy statement is reject. And all reject is saying is plainly, like, do not deliver this mail under any circumstances. So we have a table that contains the current list of valid fields and some example values within the record format. The only two of these that are absolutely required are the first two. You must have a version tag, and the value of that must be DMARC1. If this tag isn't found, your record is considered ill-formed, and a receiver-side implementation will treat it as any other text record that's not a DMARC record. The spec doesn't advocate that the receiver-side implementation make a best effort to try and make sense out of a hashed-up DMARC record. You've got to publish it in the right format. We don't want to have bizarre behavior of the email infrastructure based to people trying to figure out what to do with poorly formed records. The next field that's required is the P field. So you have to tell the record processor what you expect them to do. If you use a token that's not recognized, you have an invalid record. There's no default value of none. This is something we've discussed back and forth. We plan on releasing an update to the spec draft next year where we may change, but the current behavior is it's got to have none, quarantine, or reject, or your record's not recognized. Again, it's the same reason. Like if we leave it up to the receivers to decide, they may decide to fail to reject, and others may decide to fail over to none, and then you now have inconsistent behavior, and the whole thing looks like a mess. We didn't cover it in the examples, but if you want to, you can protect all of the subdomains below the domain where the DMARC is found, and so that's what the SP field does. So you could do something like for in example.com, you could say quarantine or report, but if you know you don't have any subdomains below that level, you could just instruct receivers to reject everything there. So that is sort of one concession to protecting against the use of your organizational or brand identity type domain. One way to protect against abuse of that. You wouldn't want somebody rolling up to, say, foo.example and then landing a successful attack in the inbox. So that's kind of what the notion is here. The percentage field, just to reiterate it, everything below P in this table is an optional field, and they are our default values associated with it. So just to make that point totally clear, you don't have to have a subdomain policy. So the percent field is essentially something that lets you control the degree to which a receiver will apply the policy you've selected. It defaults to 100%. So if you publish a reject policy and you don't specify the PCT field, then your policy gets applied 100% of the time. If you specify 50, out of 100 messages, roughly, because this is, if you have a highly distributed, inbound infrastructure on the receiver side, there's no way to guarantee this, but the idea is that everything that individual MTA processes, if it sees 100 messages from your domain, 50 of them could potentially be subject to the reject policy, and 50 of them would not. So there's an interest.
What would be the other 50%? There would be none?
Yes. So the question was, what would happen to the other 50%? Would they be none? That's actually, you're almost an audience plant. I was just going to get to that. So the way that we've designed it is that you can think of the percentage field as sort of a mixer. So if your policy is quarantine and it's at 50%, that other 50% of the messages will fall back to none. If your policies reject, then the 50% that are selected out will fall back to quarantine. There's been, again, we've been at this for about 2 or 3 years in serious discussion of the different drafts. And where we arrived is we want the process of policy deployment to be iterative. So if you publish a none policy and you go through the whole process of figuring out, what problems you have with your auth infrastructure, and you sort of footprint who is spoofing your domains, and then you get to the point where you feel confident enough to ratchet it up to quarantine, we don't see the sense in once you've gone through all of the policy stuff at quarantine and you go to reject, of having you sample out back to none. That just doesn't make any sense to us. So for the purpose of DMARC, we've said that you just fall back to the next one. So you go from reject to quarantine or quarantine to none. The ADKIM and ASPF, this is how you control the alignment mode individually. So rather than setting alignment at the level of the record, at the DMARC level, if you will, what these fields let you do is say what value you want for each of the underlying authentication mechanisms. And so you can imagine today we have 2 auth mechanisms that power DMARC, SPF, and DKIM, so there are 2 alignment fields. Should there be a 3rd one added, you could expect this to expand. So this is kind of one of the inherent sort of areas of expansion in the protocol. We don't know what will be invented next year or the year after that. So we've decided to bake into the protocol the ability to individually control the alignment that you want. And as the publisher, the domain owner, as we refer to people who publish the DMARC records, you sort of know best what you want to do here because you know how you send your mail and how your infrastructure is set up and to whom you've delegated sending permission. The next 2 fields, RUA and RUF, control where the reports that DMARC compliant receivers can generate can go. By actually setting this tag, that declares that you're opting into getting the reports, and then the address specified in the tag itself just tells the receiver where to send it. The spec provides the ability to do this over mail too, so send the reports as email. There's also an HTTP option, and you can have more than one element in there, so you can cause your reports to go to multiple addresses. I see we're going to take some questions. I see some folks raising their hands.
Is it possible for someone to set up a malicious domain, publish a DMARC record, and thereby cause unwanted email to be sent to a third party?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Yeah, so just one thing on there before additional questions get asked. There is I believe between the first and second versions of the draft, we introduced section 8.2, which deals with the ability for a report receiver to publish who they are willing to, another report generator, who they will, sorry, I always get this one backwards. There's a handshake that takes place that says, like, I will accept reports from so-and-so, or I will generate them from so-and-so. So that's baked in and borrowed from the AFREF definition, I believe. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit.
Can you quickly explain how to put in multiple RUA or RUF entries?
Sure. You just comma separate them. So you have multiple mail to or HTTP URI, and you comma delimit them within the field. The fields individually are semicolon delimited.
What is the reason for allowing different alignment modes for DKIM and SPF?
Okay, it's a good question. Again, sort of going back to most of the people in this room have had a long-standing email sending practice. You probably work, if you're on the sending side, you almost certainly don't do it all yourself. You work with multiple partners. In the event that the sort of most restrictive, like my default nature is like just clamp it all down, like lock it down as tight as possible. If that causes DMARC to not be able to work for a significant chunk of the email sending population, we won't reach our goal. So the goal for this is in part to make the thing very flexible so that as many people as possible can adopt it and make it so that they can change it if at a later time they decide to phase in a different practice.
But then, can you think of what would an example be for why someone would want to specify strict for DKIM and relaxed for SPF or vice versa?
The example I always come back to for SPF is the bounce domain stuff. Because we're validating the envelope sender, it's just common to have bounces.whoeveryouare.com. We don't want you to have to change what you're doing there in order for a DMARC to work. It's just the fact that in a previous job I held, for those of you that know me, where I worked for a large internet mail receiver, if we pulled samples of messages, you know, from a stream of several billion inbound messages a day, 20 to 100,000 distinct domains on a daily basis, and you compare what their signing practice is with what you see in the envelope, there's enough diversity there that you are locking out like 50% of possible participants if you go one way or the other. Part of the reason we went to interop and released the standard out into the world is DMARC.org is not an infinitely large organization, and so part of the rationale was get more people playing with this sooner and see if within that set of possible combinations there's our equivalent of an elevation of privilege or some way to some other way to subvert the system or achieve a DMARC mechanism pass when it should have been otherwise. To date, nobody has lodged a persistent challenge there. Does that answer your question? Any other questions on reporting? Okay, so the final fields deal with the format of the reports as well as the intervals. For the aggregate reports, the DMARC specification itself defines the report. It's an XML-based report, zipped up, and it's part of the spec itself, so we don't offer any options there for changing the format of the aggregate report. For the forensic reporting format, I believe there are two possible ones. We call out one here, that's the auth failure reporting format, which is basically your 3-part MIME format like ARF. The last item is the interval. So here I think we've got this set to 4 hours. It's a reporting interval in minutes. So there's a consideration we'll talk about in a little bit about how you should set this interval. This is the request from the sender to the receiver/report generator for how often they would like to get their reports. And note that it does only apply to aggregate. If you are a receiver and you're DMARC conforming and you are willing to provide forensic reports, we just ask that you do it in real time. So we just wanted to sort of provide an example, the simplest possible DMARC record to get started. In the grand tradition of cut and paste stuff to try it out, we sort of asked ourselves, like, where would we want everybody to get started? You know, if you already do DKIM and you already do SPF and you know your practices are pretty good, what is the record you should start with? So we said, make it a reporting only policy and just verify that what you think your practices are, they in fact are. So if you think SPF is rock solid and you know everybody that's sending email and you think you have a good handle on your outbound infrastructure, know where every server is and what it's doing, start with a report only policy and opt into aggregate reporting. We spent some time earlier talking about alignment. Alignment defaults to relaxed. So this is probably the most permissive policy we could conceive of in terms of it'll, well, that's the best way of saying it. It's the most permissive policy. Like, you haven't really scoped it down at all. And so when we talk about dipping a toe in the pool, the idea is you can pretty much get along with a report-only policy if your goal is to understand who's trying to impersonate you or abuse your organizational domain or subdomains thereof. But what we really want you to do is start advancing the aggressiveness of your policy. So as a first step, we would say go to a quarantine policy, and if you have discovered a lot of issues during your initial report-only and data gathering phase, maybe you don't want to default to 100% quarantine policy, so just pick a low number. We chose 10. So 1 out of every 10 messages that fail the DMARC mechanism will be subject to this quarantine policy. This is something you can observe, and of course you get the reports on it. Note here that we've specified both the aggregate report and the forensic report. Don't underestimate the power of getting both of them. Most receivers, in our experience, will only generate the aggregate report because the forensic report is essentially an unredacted. We recommend that it's an unredacted copy of the message as was received. So there are definitely cases where there will be legitimate failures, and you could be repeating back or reflecting personally identifying information and other stuff. And we'll talk about the need to do a thorough security audit and understand what your organization's policies will tolerate. Like, if you're at a place that's big enough that you have a privacy team or you have a legal department, you're going to want to consult with them on this stuff before you implement forensic reporting as a receiver. So this is kind of our dream policy. So, we're kind of hawkish when it comes to policy. We want, again, I'm not saying we want to throw all the mail away, but we want to be very aggressive about rejecting email that doesn't pass the DMARC check. As Mike talked about earlier, to pass DMARC, you only have to get one aligned authentication result, just one. And so when you look at where the false positives the false positive failures in auth come from, if you're just doing SPF, anytime somebody forwards your mail, anytime somebody relays it through an intermediary, or if there's mailing lists involved, you're going to fail. Chances are very high. If that message is also signed, the chances of that failure impacting you when it comes to DMARC go down dramatically. So it really is like a peanut butter and chocolate kind of thing. Hopefully that sort of analogy kind of carries, right? It's like these things are definitely better together, so do both. Here we've gone to the default of saying % = 100. The idea is that our imaginary domain here, example.com, has gone through the iterative steps we laid out where they figure out like, what are our problems? They step up to quarantine, they observe their behavior, and then when they're ready, they just turn the guns on and go to reject. Back to Mike. We're back now in example territory.
So just checking your memory real quick on what the different records look like. So is this a valid DMARC record? No, what's wrong with it? Missing the version. Very good. There's only 2 required fields, version and P equals, correct. All right, a question about the DNS lookup mechanism. What DNS text record will be queried for mail from foo.example.com? Very good. And if no record is found there, then what will happen? Very good. First, you start with the exact from domain, which in this case is foo.example.com, and look for _dmarc.foo.example.com. If you don't find a record there, you go all the way to the organizational domain and check for a record at _dmarc.example.com. Okay, so we've talked about organizational domains, we've talked about identifier alignment, we've talked about the different parts of the DNS record and what they mean. Now it's time to put it all together and see if you guys can, looking at DMARC DNS record and an email header, tell what's going to happen. This is one of the goals of the DMARC effort, is we wanted to come up with a system that was consistent and given a record and an email header, everybody can tell you reliably what's going to happen with it, and that'll happen consistently every time. So in this example, given this DMARC record for _.example.com, we have a valid version tag. Is this email aligned? We get a yes. Why? SPF is pass. And alignment is relaxed by default. If you don't specify it, it is relaxed. So in this case, the return path domain is foo.example.com. SPF passes. The from domain is example.com. They share an organizational domain, therefore they're in alignment. And everything is hunky-dory. So in this exercise, so given this record for _dmarc.example.com, is this email aligned? I heard a no. Seeing people shake their heads. Can anybody explain why it doesn't pass? DKIM is set to strict. Very good. SPF does not pass. DKIM passes, however, they have specified strict alignment in a DKIM equals. Since DKIM alignment is in strict mode and the DKIM domain does not exactly match, this mail is unaligned. So given that this is unaligned, what will actually happen to this email? Where does the buck stop? It'll pass. No policy action will be taken. The results will be included in the requested aggregate report, and the message will be processed as normal. That doesn't necessarily mean that it'll end up in the inbox. There's still local policy, there's still heuristic filters, there's still reputation throttling and filtering, there's all that other stuff that's going to happen to the email regardless. DMARC has no impact on that. But in this instance, since P equals is none, no negative action will be taken on this email because of the DMARC result. All right. So now given this record for _DMARC.example.com, is this email aligned? Anybody? I see people shaking their heads. Why?
SP is rejected. Some domain policies reject.
Okay.
And none of them passes. Results quick.
This is actually a trick question. It depends on whether there is a DMARC record at _dmarc.bar.example.com. because the exact from domain is bar.example.com, and that record will be looked at first. Our overachiever has already answered the follow-up question. If there is no record at underscore dmarc.bar.example.com, is the email aligned? And you said no. That's correct. Both SPF and DKIM are in strict alignment mode, and neither exactly match the from domain. Okay, so given that, what's going to happen to this email? Be rejected. That is correct. The subdomain policy specifies reject, and since this is a subdomain of example.com, that is the policy that is applied. This email will be rejected, and the results will be included in the requested aggregate report, and a forensic report will be sent as well. All right. Paul's now going to talk about a little bit of the specifics of what's included in the reports, and after that, we're going to split up for the breakouts.
I actually had a follow-up question, Mike.
Okay.
So in that example where it failed alignment and the aggregate report was sent, would a forensic report actually be sent as well?
It is unaligned and was rejected, and they have specified an RUF address, so yeah, they should send one to postmaster@example.com.
Cool. So we will talk about this again, but the important part here is that because the DMARC mechanism it failed for that particular message, the forensic report would have been sent.